I'm sure you guys remember. Come on.
Yes.
We mentioned about biases such as when we already have certain beliefs and we tend to pick data that correspond to these.
Yeah, but I was actually looking for a story where that's the theoretical explanation. But a story, one of the stories I told where we had disagreements or where people could potentially have disagreements, but they didn't know why. Yeah.
I remember something about version of extra-judicial.
Yep, that was one. So if you remember, I showed this story about two siblings who went to bed together, and I was asking, was that right? And you all knew it wasn't right. But then I said, why? And you all had huge difficulties in telling me why it wasn't right. You said it was incest. I said that was circular. Then I mentioned my own argument with my friend Giovanni, where he had one idea about immigration, Muslim immigration. I had a completely different idea. It took us months to really work out why we were disagreeing. And in the end, even though we got some sort of solution, it wasn't really, we weren't really. So there was some sort of prejudices there. Now, as in that last lecture, I want to base my discussion today about a specific story. I'm going to take as my question, should the Philippines legalize abortion? Just so we all know, it's not currently legal under any circumstances, I don't think that. No circumstances. Okay, and we know there's arguments on both sides. We're going to find right to life, people telling you that human life is sacred. People telling you that the fetus is a human life, therefore killing a fetus is murder, society prohibits murder, therefore, beautiful series of syllogisms, we have to prohibit abortion. And then we have people saying, no, but a woman has a right to bodily autonomy. How dare you tell a woman what she can do? And they will say that scientifically, an early embryo is not a human life in any meaningful sense. Even if they think an embryo is a life in some sense, they'll say, but yes, there are situations in which surely you have to allow abortion. Like, for instance, danger to the life of the mother. If carrying on the pregnancy could kill the mother, or like that, if the child can't be born anyway. What if the mother has been raped? What if the child is going to have a terrible handicap, which means either it's going to die or it's going to go through terrible suffering in its life? Then I can be pragmatic. I can just say, well, even apart from that, supposing I make abortion illegal, I could say that personally, I would never want to have an abortion. I think that abortion is immoral. But if I make it illegal, then people are going to go and have illegal backstreet abortions. And we know that causes lots of deaths and sufferings. So, we know that the law does sometimes allow things which we don't approve morally. Maybe on purely pragmatic grounds, it'd be better to allow some abortions. Or we could say, who has abortion? Someone who goes through an abortion. It's not a lightweight decision. It's something that makes you suffer terribly. So we have this person who makes this terrible choice, and then we punish them on top of that. We send them to jail on top of that. Even if you think they're wrong, even if you think they've sinned, was something in the gospel about judge not, but forgive them. So should we really be putting them in jail? And so the conclusions of all this: women must not be punished for abortion. Abortion must be. So we have two sides to this case being put with great vehemence on both sides. Now, first thing I want to say, in the discussion we're going to have, I'm not interested in whether abortion is moral for you as a person. You can be a person who believes that abortion is immoral. but you would never do it, ever. But you could still believe, for all these reasons, that it's better not to have it illegal, or not to have it illegal in all circumstances. Similarly, and some rather nasty people, that's actually can say, I believe that abortion should be completely illegal, except me or my friends. Not also happens. Or unless I can make a big medical fee by offering it. So we can have contradictions on both sides. That's not what we're talking about. The disagreement we're going to have today is just about it's not about the morality of abortion, it's about the legality of abortion. And the two can be separate things. Now, if I take my strict epistemological view of disagreement, the only real question I can ask is, who is right and who is wrong? And in this lecture, I'm going to argue that at the very best, that question has no simple answer. Because, look at these arguments, there's a point to them. You look at these arguments, there's a point to them too. So, there's no obvious logical or philosophical way to say in absolute terms one of those two sides is completely wrong. But that doesn't stop me from asking other questions. So, I assume most of you have a position on abortion. How would you justify that? What sort of arguments could you bring to say that legalization of abortion is good or legalization of abortion is not good? Why do you have that? Why do you have that position? I'm sure we probably have different positions with them. What are the origins of that position? Where's it come from? Have you spent weeks and months reading all the books about abortion and studying all the arguments? I have a suspicion the answer for all of us, including me, is no. Why? I'm supposing you're arguing with somebody who has the opposite position to you. Why does that person have this position? Why has he or she got to this? Is it possible? Is it meaningful? You could both be right in some sense. Supposing you're an outside observer. I'm observing you and you arguing about it. Is there any way I, as an outside observer, can say who is right? Later on, in other lectures, I'm going to say, okay, so we're in this sort of disagreement, how should we behave? But for the moment, I'm going to limit myself to the questions I've just been raising. So, how can I justify my own position? Where does it come from? How can I distinguish between two different positions? Now, I'd like to start off by introducing a distinction which is fundamental to a lot of philosophy in the past, which I don't fully accept. But first of all, let's understand it before we reject it. So look at all these statements and disagreements we've either discussed already or we're going to discuss during the course. Can you, by any way, divide them into two groups according to what they're about, the subject matter of the disagreement? Be creative. Think about the concept of facts. Can you see which of these disagreements is about a fact? Yeah.
The first one is definitely a disagreement about the fact.
This is definitely about a fact. We agree about that. Okay. Other factual disagreements. Second one, we're going to discuss that in the next section. Maybe I'm going to argue that the sun does go around here. But for the moment, let's take the second one as a fact. So what about the third one? I'm glad you have doubts. Okay, I'll leave you with your doubts. What about the fourth one? Is that about fact? Is that a fact? No, what is it? What's it about? I heard someone say something. It's an opinion, but that makes it, I think we can be a bit stronger than that. Is like I can have an opinion about this, so it doesn't really distinguish them.
Political stance.
Sorry?
A political stance.
It is a political stance, and the political stance derives from, this is not called a leading question. But it's a value. No, what are my values? If I see those arguments we looked at on just in the previous slide, which ones do I regard as being most important, most inclusive? This one. The USA should or shouldn't allow free immigration. Is that what's that? I think this is also about values. If your dog dies, is it okay to eat it for breakfast? That's the sort of value thing. Courses in philosophy should or should not be renamed as courses in American philosophy. Well, it's a value judgment there. It's certainly not a fact. Picasso is a better artist than Leonardo da Vinci. I think this is a value judgment. And we're going to, later on, I'm going to have a personal disagreement. Should Susan accept an invitation to have dinner with their ex? Maybe that's about values. So, what I'm saying is, there's a huge proportion of real disagreements in the real world are not about facts. And if we just reduce our whole discussion about disagreements to factual disagreements, where we can produce hard evidence and measurements and this sort of thing, well then, most interesting disagreements we're not going to be able to talk about. You know, seriously, we're really interested in men and games. It's not that important, but you might be really interested in whether we should legalize abortion. I bet you're really interested about whether your girlfriend, boyfriend should send evening out with their ex. So, the distinction I'm trying to make is there's a big distinction between judgments about facts, or at least I'm not trying to say this. People claim there is a big distinction between judgments about facts and judgments about values. Now, one philosopher will put, it's not the only philosopher to talk about this, I think you would probably find them all over the place, going back to the ancient Greeks. But David Hume made a very strong distinction between facts and values. He said, if we talk about facts, if we talk, for instance, about science, or if we talk about history, or if we talk about who committed a murder, there is a fact of the matter. Something really happened, and we can be right about it, and we can be wrong about it. And we can have a certain degree of certainty about how right and how wrong we are about it. If we think he is the murderer, but actually there's only one eyewitness who's half blind who saw him at 3 miles distance, well then he may be, but the evidence is rather weak. If we arrest him and he's got the knife in his hand and his DNA is all over the place, and he had a strong motive for doing the murder, and he confesses without even being tortured, then we have quite strong evidence that maybe he actually is the murderer. So, when it's a matter of fact, we can actually reach, so secure, we can actually reach conclusions which have some degree of certainty about it. Now, when you go and talk about values, this is no longer the case. So, if you think, when we talk about scientists, scientists are pretty clear about which is the order of the orbits of the planets. You know, the one closest to the sun is Jupiter, then we have Venus, then we have Earth, then we have Mars. They got a consensus on this. It took them a little time, but they're really pretty sure about this. Now think about a moral issue. Any moral issue which interests you. Like, for instance, thou shalt not kill. How do we interpret that? And you will find that people have been arguing this for the last 2,000 years. Is there a consensus? Of course there's no consensus. I think people are just as much in dispute about this today as they were at the time of Jesus. So people find it very hard to reach consensus about values. And the same thing applies to aesthetics, you know. What do you think about Beethoven? Some people think it's wonderful, some people think it's boring, some people have never heard it, and so on. Hume said, our value judgments, unlike our factual judgments, depend on our own personal psychology. He called it the passions. And not only did he say it depends on our personal psychology, he said that's a very good thing. He said reason is and should be the slave of the passions. Reason as applied to practical value judgments. So, in Hume's mind, we should follow what our intuitions tell us. So if our intuitions tell us that we don't like the idea of abortion, we should follow them. If our intuitions tell us we should not eat dog or we should not eat buns, we should just follow those intuitions. Now, in the example we had last week, most of you had an intuition that Julie and Mark were wrong. Let's try a different case. Family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. The family had heard, I don't know where, that dog meat was delicious. So they cut up the dog's body, roasted it, and had it for dinner. Now, what do you think about that intuition? Do you think they were right to do that or wrong to do that? It's obviously a trick question. Do you see anything morally wrong with that? Really, just consult your passions. Don't start thinking you're philosophical argument. Just what's your reaction to that? It's gross. It's gross. Does anyone think it's not gross? Okay, this room, me too. I love my dog, but I don't like it for dinner. This room believes this is gross. Now, just about all Westerners think this. But we also know that in some parts of the world, some very close to here, eating dogs is considered as being okay. So, what do I get from this? We see it also in issues like abortion. Different people with different backgrounds can have very different moral intuitions. So I can't just say, follow your intuition, follow your nose, because it's going to lead us to contradictory answers. So let's go back to my disagreement with Giovanni about Muslim immigration. When we talked about it last week, I said that we are both suffering from confirmation bias. Giovanni, because of his background or because of his personality, is really, really attached to his community. He thinks anything which can keep this community stable and stop people with awful veils coming in and spoiling his view is a good thing. And I, with my cosmopolitan background, I like to find fault with strange countries. I think, no, this is diversity, this is good. And I actually enjoy being, in my university, we have lots of Muslim women going around in veils. And for me, this is a positive point for the university. It's not even positive just morally. I just enjoy it. It makes me feel good when I see people going around. So maybe some of our differences are, as Hume suggests, due to our private psychology. My personality is more open to diversity than Giovanni's. But that's not really a very convincing explanation for everything. Maybe some of our moral intuitions really do depend on purely personal factors. Some biologists might say it depends on your genes. I have no idea if that is true or false. But I would argue there's a lot of cases where it definitely doesn't. I'm not saying it never does, but I think it's too strong to say it always depends just on individual factors. So remember, going back to Giovanni, remember he came from an Italian liberal culture which regards Catholicism as the enemy, and which then tends to extend that to all religion, including Islam. So I think this had an important role in Giovanni's personal intuitions about Muslim immigration. This was immigration by a strongly religious community, and he saw that as a bad, as a threat. And when I said I came from a different tradition, where religion was viewed very positively as a rebellious force against nasty authorities, Jesus is a rebel. This was the way I was taught. And where religious freedom, the Pilgrim Fathers, was a fundamental value. So I got a different set of, you could call it prejudices, you could call it biases, but my confirmation bias worked in a totally different way from Giovanni's. And what we see here is that what counts a lot is the background you come from. Giovanni, I think, in his position, had a knee-jerk reaction against religion. That was his big point. And I had a knee-jerk reaction in favor of religious freedom, or people not being told what clothes they were meant to wear. And that was my point. And if we were really very honest on those basic issues, I don't think either of us had read all the literature, studied all the arguments. I don't think either of us had really thought about this very deeply. These were intuitions which we'd inherited from our respective cultures without too much thought. I suspect a lot of your moral intuitions, for instance, about incest, for instance, about eating dogs, for instance, about abortion, whichever way you think about it, comes from your parents, your colleagues, your friends, from the general culture to which you belong. Of course, we don't all belong. We all belong to several cultures. You know, I'm English, I'm an academic, I'm a scientist. I have several different cultures. That's true for all of you too. But the combination of your respective cultures gives you a set of moral intuitions which are different from the set of moral intuitions of somebody who comes from a different background. So, going back to our original question, you've got one set of moral intuitions. I've got a different, maybe conflicting set. How on earth do we decide between them? Or should we decide between them? Now, if you are Hume, or if you are the early Wittgenstein, you have an easy answer to that question. You say, I can't decide. You'll say, they're meaningless questions. You'll say that all I can do is follow my passion and let the best man or best woman win. In fact, David Hume tells me that's what I must do. It's a moral imperative. I have to follow my passions, and if I don't, I'm not a proper human being. But I don't really agree. You know, can I really say that on all issues concerning value, all we can do is just fight? Or if that sounds a bit weak, it means I have to keep on cutting out all the interesting problems. You know, I'm left with discussing what Andrew James has called or about abstruse things in astronomy, maybe. I don't really enjoy the world in which we do all this. So I want to try and take a different perspective. So far, I've shown that different people with different cultures develop different moral intuitions. So before I start judging between them, I want to ask the question, why do they develop these different intuitions? And I'll start off with philosophy, but move through to some more scientific answers. Now, I'm sure you've all studied philosophy, and you all know about Nietzsche. Nietzsche is very important because he put in writing some things which many people in the West in the 19th century were beginning to intuit. Now, if you were in the West until the 18th century, and I asked you where do your values come from, well, I think you had a very, very simple answer. Of course, they come from God. They're written in the Bible. The church tells me about those values. Maybe today in the Philippines, many people are going to reply in exactly the same way. But Nietzsche begged to differ. He deeply, deeply disagreed. He said, we have no space for God. Why should we believe in God? There's no possible reason to believe in God. Where's the scientific evidence? There ain't none. He says, values do not come from God. He says, values are created by human beings. Actually, that's a bit generous to Nietzsche. Nietzsche actually sort of said, values are created by contemplatives. In other words, people like me. I will write good books like Zarathustra, and then you will read the books, and then you will be converted to new, more valid values. Whatever has value in our world doesn't have value in itself according to its nature. Nature is valueless. I see a tiger, I see a leaf, I see a cloud. Does that have value? No, it doesn't. It's given value by human beings who say the tiger is a beautiful animal, which incidentally, no one says that there's too many tigers in the area. And it's us, according to Nietzsche, who gives value to things. Now, that's the philosophical perspective. And just for once in these lectures, I'm going to talk about my own professional work, which is in the area of cultural evolution. This is what I actually did until recently for a living. What do I mean by cultural? Cultural evolution is an explanation, or it tries to be, an explanation of why we have certain beliefs, why we have certain behaviors, why we have certain priorities, therefore, why we have certain values. And it tries to explain changes and differences in culture using the same model we use or similar models, the model we use to explain changes and differences in biology. So, in biological evolution, we know there is variation. I take all the dogs in the world, some are big, some are small, some are brown, some are black, some are fast, some are slow, some are clever, some are very, very dumb, and so on. And I submit them to selection. If they're in the wild, if these are Filipino dogs living in villages, the very big ones don't do well. They eat far too much food. The village doesn't give enough food. If they're very small, they don't do very well because the big dogs keep them away from the food. So Filipino village dogs and village dogs throughout the world have developed into Ascal, or Ascal-like dogs. Medium-sized, they're yappy, they're very, very good at getting food from all over the place, and they're extremely successful. So dogs, the shape and size and intelligence of dogs, the shape and size and intelligence of Ascal is shaped by the environment where they live. The theory of cultural evolution says the same happens to cultures. They're shaped to adapt to the environment in which they live. So, in genetics, we have genes. The various features of a dog are carried in its genes. In cultural evolution, we talk about memes. This is not memes in that memes is a bad evolution of the word meme. It does not mean some guy who falls off his horse in the middle of an Instagram or something like that. It means a unit of information transmitted from one person to another person. Now, if you've got sub-memes, for instance, if you have a meme which teaches you how to hunt very effectively or one particular hunting skill, this helps you to survive. And if you've got these people in your society, it helps your society to survive. So this meme tends to spread. If you have a meme that damages your society, so for instance, supposing you have a meme which says, whenever there's a war, I run away, which is not good for your society, then these memes tend to become less common. So the basic claim of the theory of cultural evolution is that ideas, values, behaviors, practices which are successful in an environment tend to spread. And ideas, values, practices which are not successful tend not to spread. So what we have today is a whole series of values and things which have been successful in the past. Now there's an additional point we should add to that. Epigenetics is actually a rather nasty phenomenon called selfish genes. Sometimes genes spread, not because they're useful for the host organisms, but just because they could have spread it. So, particularly if you have a mutation in one of your cells, which causes it to reproduce uncontrollably, then you get cancer. Yes, the gene does spread a lot. It spreads in its own interest. It doesn't spread in the interest of the host. And the same can apply to memes. So, for instance, when we got anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, this was an extremely successful meme. It spread through Germans amazingly fast, but it actually led Germany to start World War II. It actually led to the destruction of Germany and the deaths of millions of Germans, apart from all the other people who got killed. So even from a very selfish German perspective, this particular meme was bad for you. And so, we can start asking whether a meme is actually helpful to the society where it is involved, or whether it is a selfish meme, which, yes, it can spread, it may be successful in spreading, but it actually damages society. Can you think, what sort of memes, what sort of cultural practices might help a society? Think of Filipino society, just to be choose one. Well, so for instance, supposing I have some degree of altruism. Imagine that I see a kid in danger and I help that kid. A society where that behavior is common is likely to do better. More kids will survive than a society who sees the kid in danger and just ignores it. Imagine a society, Kant gave an example. Kant says, imagine a society where everyone lies if it's in their interest to get money. Well, would a society like that ever work? You know, I promised to pay you 1,000 pesos, and then I just refuse to pay you. I deny I ever said it. The society is going to fall apart. Everyone's going to be fighting the whole time. There's some common work needs to be done. You know, there's a flood. I need to help people get out of their homes into safe places. Well, in most societies, successful societies, everyone chips in and helps. If that sort of behavior is missing, society is going to fall apart. So some forms of cultural practice are very good for society. Some others, like being, for instance, being selfish, like refusing to cooperate with anybody else, like not making any contribution to the goals of society, well, that probably doesn't work from the society's point of view. I'll leave you with an open question. I'm not even going to try and answer. We know that religion is highly prevalent. Nearly all societies in the world have some form of religion. Is that what it helps society to survive? If yes, why? Or is it just a selfish need? Somehow it's very, very good at spreading. It's just good at spreading. There's no actual positive value. And think not only about religious beliefs in life, think about religious beliefs in God's life. Think of the ones you don't approve of. Are they selfish means, or do they help society to survive in some way? Now, I'm sorry, let's just go back a second. We've got that some means may be good for society, like everyone collaborating. Some may be selfish means, like let's all collaborate to kill Jews. So what happens when people from different cultures disagree about values? Let's say about eating God. Or let's say, for instance, about the correct attitude of students in a lecture room. In my program, you don't get top marks unless you can at least once prove that your professor is wrong. Probably. You have to say, that's wonderful. That gets you maximum marks. And I think you have an intuition that that is not always, not with all professors, that's not the best way to get maximum marks in this country. And most countries, it's not the best way to get maximum marks. So we have different intuitions about this. Now, we've seen from Hume, we can't find a scientific argument why one of our positions is right and one is wrong. Why is it better to call out your professor than it is to accept every word he says? Why is it good to eat dogs or not good to eat dogs? But can we use what we've just been saying about evolution to find some sort of criteria of judgment? And I think my answer would be yes, we can, at least to some extent. And I'm going to draw on the work of another school of philosophers who were, or are, the pragmatists. This is a school of 19th century philosophy. And they said, if you want to, they started off with Pierce, actually, followed by Dewey, followed by William James, who happened to found scientific psychology while he was going about it, modern economy of the they said, when you look at ideas, don't spend so much time working out if they're true or false, because usually you can't answer that question. But look at their consequences. If I say this, does it have any, first question, does it have any consequence at all? If the answer is no, then maybe I shouldn't be wasting time about it. But supposing it does have a consequence, systems of values like the ones we've been talking about do have consequences. Even systems of aesthetics have consequences. I can have a theory of art which leads me to produce wonderful art. And I can have a theory of art which is completely sterile. So I should look at my theories and see what do these theories give me. So even if I agree with you, and I say that talking about the truth or falsity of a series of values or of aesthetic values is meaningless, I can still look at the consequences of those values for me, if I adopt my own personal ethics, or for society, if society adopts them for itself. Rorty puts it this way: we should be free to propose new vocabularies, systems of classification and description. We don't test these vocabularies by seeing whether they enable us to discover truths, or by showing they can be read off the nature of reality, brought to a set of account. Instead, we evaluate them by seeing how they enable us to achieve our current goals, my good or the good of my society. How they enable us to formulate better and more satisfying goals, and generally become better at being human. So I would argue, if I look at a system of values, I can apply those tests. Even if I can't say one particular value is false in a metaphysical sense. Now, I can draw several interesting conclusions from that. Have any of you read a wonderful book by David Warner called Natural Moralities? Well, if any of you are thinking of doing a thesis on anything to do with moral philosophy or anthropology, I would strongly recommend this book. It's a great advantage. It's almost jargon-free. It's easy to read. It's extremely convincing. So, trying to put what he says together with my cultural evolution perspective, which I think we accept, I said that values are an adaptation to the society or the culture where you live. And we have many different environments and societies in the world. So, if I'm living in the Arctic, or I'm living in the Sahara, I'm living in an area which is very resource poor, I can have one set of values. I need to have resources at all costs. My food must be very, very solid. If I'm living in a big, anonymous, modern city, I suspect my values can be very, very different. If I'm a farmer, I can expect my values are going to be different from if I'm a manual worker or a taxi driver, or if I own an Ayala mall. You know, the values are going to be different. So, I get different values for different societies. But actually, one would say, I can even get different values when I live in the same society or the same environment. Because, you know, we all live in this world. I adapt to it, dogs and Pascal adapt to it, all sorts of insects adapt to it. We don't adapt in the same way. We're all adapted to our environment. So there can be more than one way of being well adapted to your environment. And if I just take this pragmatist view of judging by consequences, as long as that way allows me to live well, either me individually, if I'm talking about my personal ethics, or the society as a whole, well then, that's just fine in one's view. But that is not the end of it. Now, one consequence which relativists like myself are often accused of is people tell us, but that just means anything goes. We've destroyed all the basis for value. You say, okay, that value over there is good, that value over there is good, that value over there is good. It's what Dostoevsky accuses the nihilists of in most of his novels. But one also introduces a second concept. He says that there can be more than one set of good values. It's for pluralism, value pluralism. But he also says, and it's what we saw in our evolutionary argument, that some values just don't cut it. They just don't work on pragmatic criteria. And this is the case I mentioned earlier with Kant. Kant says we can't build a society where lying is normal. Of course we can build a society where people occasionally lie. I don't know of any society where that's not true. Because if we make it systematic, so everyone lies all the time, well then the society is going to fall apart. Because we can never make agreements. And without agreements, we can get absolutely nowhere. So one, and I agree with him, makes a distinction between what he calls adequate systems of value. That's a system of value which allows me, or which allows my society to function in a way which I, or the society itself, judges to be adequate. But there are also inadequate values. There are values which can't let my society function. And it's absolutely okay and necessary to reject those values. So in other words, the fact there's multiple values doesn't mean that everything goes. And it means there is still space for meaningful disagreement about values. That still sounds juicy. Have any of you ever read a book called Brave New World by Aldous Huxley? Brave New World is a wonderful book. You should read it. It doesn't take more than a whole day. In about one day, you can read the whole book. And I read it when I was young, probably about your age, and it posed a big ethical challenge to me. Because I was an intuitive utilitarian. Maybe I still am intuitive. I think the greatest thing is that what we should all follow is the greatest happiness or the greatest number. And Brave New World is a huge challenge to that idea. He imagines it's a dystopia. He imagines a new world, sometime in the relatively near future, in which all children are genetically engineered. There's two classes of children. There are so-called epsilons. They are sort of slaves. They work to provide goods and services for everybody else. And there are alphas. Those are people who become the leaders, the university professors, and so on and so forth. In the Brave New World, there is no poverty and there is no hunger. In fact, there is no physical discomfort of any kind. Sorry, I'm a utilitarian. That sounds good. It's much better than people dying of hunger. It's much better than millions of poor people. Sex is free. It's a sexually liberated society. Everyone can have pleasure, male people, whatever you like, in any way you like. It's all great fun, and it doesn't lead to any disease or any nasty consequence. Also, it never leads to actually an attachment between people, because that's becomes dangerous. Entertainment is also free. They have the feels. You go to the movies and you feel what you're seeing as well as hearing and listening to it. You can always also smell what you feel, and it's always nice smells, nice feelings. It's a wonderful world. And if that's not enough, they've invented a wonderful drug called soma. So when you take it, it just makes you happy. You're not addicted to it, you just feel great. And when you after your soma drug, you don't feel bad. It has no negative consequences. It's not addictive. It doesn't make you go crazy. It doesn't make you commit crime. So it sounds like a really cool place. Now, I'll just answer this question. My question to it: would we want to live in such a place? It's obviously a rhetorical question. I think none of us would like to live there, right? We'd actually prefer to have our little dose of discomfort and pain and whatever. But we find that pretty hard to justify philosophically. Why on earth don't have this? I think the question isn't, and everyone is content. The question is not obvious. So before I try and answer that question, let's just summarize the argument so far. So, from David Hume tells us, if we believe him, it's meaningless to say that one set of views, one set of values is true, and another set is false. What we can say is that one set of values works better. It's better for society than another set of values. And we can also say that a value system that works in one environment maybe it doesn't work in another environment as adaptation. We can also say that even in the same environment in society, we can have multiple value systems which all work. But we know that some values do not work. Okay, so some are inadequate. This is what Kant tells us about life. And now, with Great New World, we've discovered something else, which just makes everything complicated. Now, by everything we've said so far, Great New World is a totally adequate society. Its values work. You know, it has all sorts of nice things about that what's happened. But the new finding I'm adding here is that some adequate value systems are really nice. In other words, you can have a system of values which does work for society, which is stable, which can last over time. They won't all collapse. Like, if I say that an inadequate system is like the values of Nazi Germany, that's an easy target. We all know that, isn't it? But some value systems, it's not so obvious. Like Great New World, if someone just puts stuff on that and does good marketing, they might be able to sell it. And yet, we think they really are pretty nice. So, now we get back to the concept of disagreement. We have, in the end, we have to, if we believe a little bit in religion, we have to decide what system of values we want. Sure, and we all have our own prejudices, our own biases, our own confirmation biases, like I do. Disagreements can help us to work out whether a given set of values works. We can discuss it. I can give you examples of where it works. You can bring counterexamples where, in your opinion, it doesn't work. So this could be a valuable contribution. It can help us to work out whether we like the way it works. So I tell you, I'm sure I can tell you Great New World, the way in which we all say this is what I want. But if we discuss it deeply, and I say that you really want this, you really want that, I think after the discussion, quite likely, we reach a consensus that this is not what we want. So discussion can give us bigger understanding. And if we are a big niche, disagreement can actually help us to create new values. The whole point of Nietzsche is that values are created by humans. My cultural evolution work says it's created by societies. It's not really individual. I don't believe in the role that philosophers create values. No, but societies as a whole do create values. And this is what Jonathan Haidt says. He says we shouldn't, when we're talking about values, we shouldn't think so much about conscious reasoning by philosophers and so on. We should talk about the dynamics of a society which gradually creates its own values. Now, I'm coming to an end. I'd like to just contrast this model, what we've just been talking about, with what is traditionally said. And the two diagrams I'm going to show you both come from Jonathan. First one, we have a situation like someone's proposing to eat my dog. This causes an emotional reaction. I reason about this. I can also reason about some facts like, is my dog good to eat? What's the information available on the internet about the taste of dogs and so on. But in the end, I reach a judgment. This is my own individual act of evaluation and judging. But Haidt, and I agree with Haidt here, says this doesn't actually happen. He says this is a false model of what actually happens. He says, so we have a situation, and I get an intuition, I make a judgment, I reason about it, but I talk to me about it. I talk to other people about it, which almost certainly involves disagreement. And he makes a judgment, and he reasons, and all this goes round in a circle. And it's this circle of continuous discussion and disagreement which actually gives us our values. So let's go back to the question I had at the very, very beginning of the lecture. Look at my summary at the arguments on both sides. We can add other arguments as well. I'm not claiming that this is an exhaustive list. Now, the issue of whether or not a fetus is a human life has the grammatical form of a fact. I'm going to argue in my next lecture this is somewhat fallacious, but I'm not going. This isn't actually a fact. It's something else. But we'll leave that for another time. But now let's look at the other points. Human life is sacred. That is without any doubt at all. It's a value. And the other things here are derived from that value. If I say a woman has a right to bodily autonomy, this is a value. If I say the woman has to be protected against these dangers, these are values. If I say you mustn't be cruel to a woman who is in this situation, these are values. So, if I'm sort of relativist get accused of and say that they're all just the same, they're just passions. We're just human. We just sort of, if you feel really strongly about this, well, carry on fighting for it. And if you feel really strongly about this, carrying on fighting about that. But I think most people would find that as a very inadequate way of facing the question. Today in the US, when they discuss about abortion, we've had extreme positions. We have abortion doctors who've been shot. We have states which have made it illegal to have abortions, even in cases of rape, even in cases in which the mother's life is in danger, even in cases where it's certain the baby is not going to live. And I think most of you, whatever you believe about the values of abortion, thinks that sort of thing is a very poor outcome. If you hear that in countries, well, I don't know any numbers for the Philippines, I don't even know if numbers exist. But in Italy, where I lived for 40 years of my life, abortion was also illegal. And we have huge deaths every year of women having illegal, unsafe, backstreet abortion, not in hospitals, not with doctors, with knitting needles and this sort of thing. And they die. And I think nearly everyone, including people on this side of the argument, will agree that those are dreadful outcomes. So, I think, so on an issue like this, we really need to discuss. And the discussion can formulate the sort of laws, the sort of values we want to have. As I said at the beginning, there's no law, there's no country in the world has completely unlimited access to abortion. There are always limits. No one believes that you can have abortion at the last week of pregnancy. There are always limits to situations in which you can have abortion. There are always questions about what information the woman should get, what alternatives the woman can give. These are all things we can discuss and try and get good solutions. So I really believe that discussion is both political and morally very good thing. But not because there's a moral fact which says that you have to exist, because pragmatic it actually works. This is the way in which we've actually moved forward on many, many different issues. Now, just before I end the lecture, I'd like to just make an aside on what looks like a complete issue. Remember in lecture 1, I showed you these 2 pictures. I said we can have a disagreement. Which of these 2 pictures is the most beautiful? I don't want you to answer. Basically, my point is that when we come to aesthetics, we can say just about all the same things we said about value systems. We could say there is no truth in the matter. There's no way in logic or science I can provide you with a lab test which says that Leonardo da Vinci is beautiful, this one isn't. That doesn't exist. So Hume is right on this. I have to answer with passions. But if I am a person in 16th century Florence, there's very little doubt I'm going to find this one is better. And if I'm a French revolutionary in early 20th century Paris, I think I'm probably going to find this one is better. Because we have evolved 2 different systems of values for evaluating art. We could say that some may be more adequate than others. You know, if I take this modern thing, maybe today, in our modern environment, it allows more things, it allows more freedom to art. Maybe I can produce more interesting art than I could if I say the only good art is there by definition. It's quite possible that's true. But we can talk about how adequate these are in terms of whether they allow us to produce good art. And we can also find that there are some sets of aesthetic values which are adequate, they have huge success. I think in particular music, for instance, but which are horrible. I don't like that music. At least for me it's horrible. My passions tell me I don't like it at all. So we can also have some things which are adequate, they work, they spread widely, but which we still don't like. And we can still discuss about it. Maybe if some of you like techno music, you can actually persuade you before listening to it. It's going to be a very hard job, because I have deep cultural resistance. It might be possible. So that's all I have to say for this afternoon. But some of you might have some objections. You could say, but you just remember the distinction at the beginning. All you've been talking about is values. And we know that values are relative. And we know that we don't have a proper scientific background for values. So yeah, I'm going to grant you all this role of humans in creating their own values. I'll accept that. But that's just values. And the real, what really counts, says this positivist, what really counts are facts and science. And of course, facts and science are not created by humans. This is a perfect, clear description of the physical world as it actually is. They say the same for economics. And therefore, although we can make our own values, when it comes to facts in the real world, we just have to bow down and say, thank you very much, that's what we have, and then live with it. I think that view is completely wrong. Next lecture, on Wednesday, I'm going to talk, therefore, about facts and science. I'm going to try and show you that facts and science are just as much cultural creation as aesthetics. And that just like aesthetics, or just like values, there are adequate facts and there are totally inadequate ones. They're not all equal. It's not true that good science and bad science are equal. But you can have more than one version of good science and good facts. That's the next step. For the moment, thank you very much. We have a little time for questions. Doubts. I'd love to listen to doubts. I don't say I'm wrong. Yes.
I think getting the notion that going back to the slide about selfish needs and is it possible that in this notion that we can only distinguish or find selfish needs after the fact, after observing consequences? Is there any case where it's possible that even before any empirical observation is made, we can already say, oh, this will not work. Or this is just not going to work.
Well, I think the answer is yes, but not with certainty. So I think it's the same as when we look at things in medicine or in law. I can look at a patient and say, to me, you look sick. And you have certain clinical signs which to me suggests a very poor prognosis unless we treat you very rapidly. And I think I can say I can do the same things with some means, like maybe if I see a spread of gross racism, many other forms of discrimination, very violent things which destroy collaboration among people, and so on. I have some historical background. I know from the past that this sometimes cause bad consequences, just like the doctor knows from the past that people with these clinical signs tend to get very, very sick. So I don't know with certainty. It may be that this time's different. But yes, I can look at symptoms and say it don't look good. And I think that's one and I think the key point about disagreement is we do this better collectively than we do singly. I on my own I might be captured by them, I just don't see what's wrong with it. But someone else can point out to me, this is just your prejudices. Have you ever looked at this really? You really realize what this guy's doing. I'm sure we all have ideas. You can all replace this guy with the name of somebody. So yes, I think you can. It's not hopeless. Yes.
So for the disagreement,
Can you make it loud?
the disagreement
Yes.
cannot be reconciled. This happens, what will happen? In the case of the Prophet and the with the Muslims and the American, so it had been there since the very beginning, trying to create peace for the new battle. Even with the intervention of ceasefire, the problem still gets worse because of the disagreement.
So I'm actually going to talk about these processes in about 2 or 3 lectures time. I'm not going to talk about Mindanao, I don't know the case that well. But there are cases in the world where seemingly completely intractable problems do get resolved. And there's also cases where they don't. So I'm going to cite the case of Northern Ireland, where they've been fighting for a very long time between Catholics and Protestants, and where they achieved peace, so much so that some of the Catholic leaders have been trying to murder the Protestant leaders, and vice versa, became close personal friends and actually led the government together. It can be done. The same thing happened in South Africa, where de Klerk, who was the white leader, became friends with Mandela, and they actually worked for Mandela for peace together. And then, of course, we have total failure. Also, the current Palestinian peace process is a complete failure. So I think you can't say that things are. We never know in advance. This is the case that Northern Ireland looked about as intractable as people get, and yet they found a solution. Mindanao looks intractable. Palestine looks intractable. In some cases we have solutions, in some not. And this is why we disagree and why we talk. So we try and create creative solutions And then when I talk about Northern Ireland, which is the case I'm best, we're going to see there was a lot of creative ambiguity. There were people making words which deliberately meant one thing from one side and one thing from the other side for good purposes. It actually worked. So I don't think peace in disagreements is ever inevitable. I also don't think it's ever impossible. So it's a matter of the skill of the people on different sides and the people pressing their leaders to actually achieve it. That would be my line. But we can discuss, when I talk about peace, it'd be great to hear something about the Mindanao conflict. So I'm very interested in hearing some things I don't know.
I just have a point to raise about the David Wong position. I think that what's very interesting about Wong's position that I'm very sympathetic to is that it's possible to develop a point that recognizes, one, the role of the passions and the role of emotions in judgment and in its core value for judgment, and on the second important point, to admit a large degree of pluralism, but not go in the direction of relativism. So I think there's a heated disagreement, of course, among philosophers professionally arguing about this. But on some readings, Wong is actually a moral realist, a pluralist kind, but a moral realist. On the other end of the spectrum, we have somebody like Martha Nussbaum who talks about multiple correct answers and a range of correct answers, but so no single true morality, no single true account of value, but still being able to say that some accounts are wrong.
Well, I think Wong says some accounts.
Right. But Wong considers himself relativist and like Nussbaum. Yeah. And as an interesting point of contrast, most moral realists are committed to some form of utilitarianism.
Committed to?
Utilitarianism.
Yeah. Okay. Then we have to define utility. That's a whole other topic. Yes.
There's a clamor for the eradication of political dynasty in the country. But the answer seems to be impossible to remove the political dynasty.
To educate people. Did you say? Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
To remove
The political dynasty. There was a clamor of removing, yet still it's a part of the political system.
So, what consequences do you draw from that?
Probably seems that it's part of the function of the political system. So, in their system, to establish this political dynasty.
Can I say something in response?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think this case is very interesting because it speaks about two different sides. Those who are for political dynasties or see no problem with them, and those who are against the political dynasties. I think this is probably the majority of Filipinos, but it speaks. I think the intractability might have something to do with the imbalance of power. The people who are actually going to pass a law against political dynasties have seats in Congress. So it would be impossible, virtually. So I think it's not going to be because we can't give reasons that are convincing, but it's because people who are in a position to change the policy are not going to do it because it benefits them. That's my 2 cents.
That's actually a general thing in politics. It's extremely hard to change any form of democracy, good or bad, within the system, because the people who are in power have been elected by that system and never ever have an interest in changing it. So that it can be the English system, the American system, the Philippine system, the German system. The people in power are elected by that system and have an interest in being re-elected time and time again. So these systems tend to become very stable for that reason. But I think, as Jackie said, this is not just This is not an open issue which we have to discuss and find a cool, rational answer to. There is a political struggle between people on one side and people on a different side. And sure, I'm going to be talking about this when I talk about gay marriage later on. In those cases, I think you have no chance whatsoever of convincing your opponent. But I still think the disagreement is useful, because you can do two things. One, you can strengthen your own supporters. Give your supporters reasons to help out in the struggle. And two, it was one of the things one of you raised in one of my early lectures. You have a lot of people who don't have a fanatical position. They may be on one side, but they are willing to be convinced. And for those people, bringing reasons and disagreeing constructively can actually be very useful. And I'm going to show when I talk about gay marriage, one thing you can do is you can maybe reframe the question. So maybe the original way the question is framed is intractable. I was thinking of Mindanao maybe. But maybe there's a different way of framing the question where we can actually reach some kind of agreement. And disagreeing constructively can be a way of achieving that. Okay? Yes?
I'm just curious because you
Sorry, I
said-
come over here because I want to be able to hear.
I'm just curious because you said that Ireland and South Africa were successful, while in Palestine didn't come.
So far.
I was just thinking, why? I mean, what? The first thing that came into my mind was the people who went there to the table were all people who good here.
Not always.
So how come they were successful? What is it that made it successful? I don't understand.
I'm not really going to. I think there were a series of social and economic circumstances which made it possible, both in South Africa and in Northern Ireland. In South Africa, apartheid was really bankrupt. They had no support from anybody in the world. The Americans were fed up with it because it risks spreading communism to the rest of Africa, which is not what the Americans wanted. It was creating a communist opposition movement against it. So no one wanted apartheid. And the whites had just less and less support. And even their own people were wavering. So I actually went and taught in South Africa about 5 years ago. And it was amazing seeing all these young white people who were not politicians, they were people studying biology, saying how awful apartheid was and how great it is that now I'm with my black brothers. So I think there was a readiness for it in the society. In Ireland too, various things happened. The Catholic population was growing. It's fairly clear that sooner or later Ireland will be reunited, which is what the Catholics wanted. And the Protestants also found they were getting very little support from the English. The English weren't helping them. And there was an immense tiredness of just the murder and the violence. There weren't the mass killings like in a real war, but there were thousands of deaths. And a lot of these deaths were of civilians who were very peripheral to the whole conflict. You might be somebody's cousin, so you got yourself shot. So there was a great tiredness with the war, and people thought some sort of solution is inevitable. And in the end, the leaders on both sides realized that if they wanted to have political power at all, they had to reach an agreement. And that's why it worked. Why it failed in the case of Palestine, there were very strong factions on both sides which had no interest in an agreement at all. And in both cases, they overwhelmed their own leadership. And in this case, there wasn't international support for peace, or not complete international support. So I don't think the conditions were right for it. Maybe sooner or later, if they don't blow up the world, the Palestinians and the Israelis will make peace. It's not there at the moment, there's no sign of it. There's also one of my favorite authors is Tolstoy. Another one who I recommend to you all, for he's long. And he believes in a very contingent theory of history. Like if you read Marx or if you read many historians, it's deterministic. The world gets better and better and better. First of all, we have ancient empires. Then we have feudalism. Then we have bourgeois capitalism. Then we have communism, and the world just gets nicer and nicer and nicer. And conventional economics is basically the same thing. You know, we get more and more technology, more and more people are cured. Things get better and better and better. Tolstoy said, "Nothing of this sort. History is just a concatenation of accidents." You know, there's a big battle between Napoleon's troops and the Russians' troops. What decides it? Is it due to the wonderful planning of Napoleon or the wonderful planning of the Russians? No. It's because one soldier trips up and everyone panics and a crucial battle is lost. So there's lots of things happen for very minor reasons with huge effects. And I think if you're looking at the reasons for peace, why it succeeds sometimes and fails in others, I think you're going to find that. Yes?
Just one last question. I picked up on your comment earlier that you said no one who's all over the world would say that abortion of the later stages, for example, in the 8th and 9th, not be acceptable.
No.
But it seems that in the US at least, there's a move going in that direction.
I'm sorry, I'll interrupt you. I'm reasonably, I'll research some more. I'm reasonably certain that's false. I'm pretty certain that is part of the anti-abortion campaign who claim that is being called for. So as far as I know, the only condition in which that would ever happen would be to save the life of the mother. So I think that's probably what we call a straw dog, accusing my opponent of something which they never ever said.
Anyway, so going beyond that assumption that the results false, I was thinking that many of the arguments these days focus on some kind of moral issue. And I was wondering, have we done away with moral absolutes, or do moral absolutes still come into play when we talk about, for example, gay marriages or all those things about moral absolutes?
So I think we have to make
Moral questions.
I think we have to make a distinction here between description and prescription. Now, if I ask people involved in big moral discussions, are moral absolutes an important part of your thinking? Well, then they will definitely, many people will definitely say yes. And they'll say yes on both sides, on every side of the dispute. When ISIS cuts off the heads of Christian hostages, they are obeying in their belief a moral absolute. When people deny gay marriage, they believe they're obeying a moral absolute. When you say thou shalt not kill, and therefore thou shalt not do EJKs, people believe this is a moral absolute. So that people believe there are moral absolutes, I think, is an absolute truth. It's definitely true they believe it. Now, what we're asking in this, what I've been asking is, are they right to believe it? This is the big question Nietzsche asks. You know, should it not, do they believe it? That's a fact. But should they believe it? And in philosophy, there are some pretty coherent arguments why maybe you should not. Now, of course, if you have a strong religious faith, you will say, well, I have a revealed truth. These things are absolutely true. And there is no philosophical argument can ever prove that wrong. But I can still, as a critic, say that let's look at the consequences of your revealed truth. So when the ISIS guy says, I need to kill Christian hostages, this is a moral good, I can question that. And I can say, not only that this is bad for me, but I can say it's also extremely bad for Islam. And it is not what the Prophet ever wanted. So I can question it, even when someone says it's a moral absolute. And what I'm doing here is encouraging people to question.
In the sense, the moral absolutes is relative moral pursuits to gravity.
By definition, it's
In
absolutely.
an abstract,
In what way is the moral absolute relative?
the way you apply it in some case, for example, is the most we have to make reasons in gravity and so on.
Yes.
Right.
And when the way we apply "thou shalt not kill," you will find most of the commandments have all sorts. If you actually look at the way people have interpreted them in history, they have all sorts of glosses, interpretations, exceptions. So it's actually quite hard to formulate an absolute principle which you could say is true under all conditions. And I think that's a big challenge. And I would actually argue that if you want to reason well, it's very good to avoid giving absolute or infinite value to anything. If I say my only goal is to do this, I can always find you an example where that's not true, where some other goal or some other combination of goals beats it. So I think giving infinite value to one thing is used, maybe always, but certainly very often, a sign of bad reasoning. You can give a lot of value to something, that's fine. Saying, I want to treat human life as though it's sacred, that's great.